There's also another
All right. I'm still gonna I said 6:30, so I wonder if a few people might trickle in. But in the meantime, was everyone able to get the Ember Inspector installed? If not, if you just Google for Ember Inspector, it's a Chrome extension. Click on the first link, and then I already have it, so yours will say like an install button. And then, okay, so what we're going to do today is, so far we've been looking at using Ember Data to work with an API, and by default, it's been using this thing called JSON API. So I kind of brought it up a few times, and it's a very standardized specification for building APIs. So an API responds in a very specific format, and what you send to the API it's also expecting a very specific format. And this is cool if like you have control over your backend too. So if you're making like a side project and you have control over that backend, then you can make your backend conform to this specification. But sometimes you don't have control over it. Maybe you're working with like another person and they're building out your API and you're building the front end, right? And or maybe you're just working with like a third-party API, right? And you want to use Ember Data, but it's not following this. So how do you kind of get it all to work? And so that's kind of what I wanted to go over today, is just how could we use it to consume APIs that don't follow this specification. Just because it's a few modifications, and then you can still leverage the power of Ember Data, just not inside, just with a different formatted API. So to start, if you just want to create a new Ember app, and we're going to use do a couple examples. So I'm going to say Ember new. We'll call this Ember Data examples class. I mean, you can call it whatever you want. I called it Ember Data examples class. Okay, so I'm going to cd into that directory, and I'll open up Atom. So the two APIs I wanted to consume is the ones you guys have been using for several of the assignments, and it's the Reddit one. So we'll say cat. All right, so if we look at this one, this looks nothing like this specification, so how can we use Ember Data to consume this? And then we'll also do another one for GitHub. So API, GitHub, we can do like repos. Okay, so while that's going, anyone want to just kind of think about like the advantages of using Ember Data to consume APIs like this as opposed to just making raw $.ajax calls? Just shout out, yeah.
Sorry. When we were working with it, we didn't have to go into like data.children.entry.com. We could just say like name.
Yep. Yep, exactly. Yeah. So like thinking about yeah, so you don't have to drill down into like deeper properties, right? the advantage of not having to kind of really dive deep into those properties, like in your app, is if that API changes later, you don't have to change it all over the place, right? All you thought about was like, let's see, our example was post, right? So like, or post.name or post.title, post.body. You didn't have to think about post.attributes.body. If that were to change, then you'd probably have to go everywhere in your app and say, okay, let's redo this whole thing, right? But it's sort of isolated now through the Ember Data layer. Any others?
Does it help if like they somehow change their structure? Will Ember Data still help with?
Yeah. So kind of like what Cole was saying is, if the API changes the structure, it's sort of your app still sees what your templates see is still just like just the attributes of some model, like post.title and post.body, but it's not thinking about post. Well, if we look at this, right? In this example, we would say something like post.data.downs, right? There's that extra like data attribute, right? And so if that were to change later, we'd have to go through our app and kind of change that all over the place, right? So yeah, it's kind of isolating our app from the specifics of the API.
So when we're loading stuff in through like regular JSON API serializer, it gets turned into like an Ember specific model object, right?
Yeah. So when we created all those models, right, they were like ds.model, right? So we said Ember generate model post, and then there was a file called post.js that said export default ds.model, right? And so it was a very rich model. We could add custom methods and custom attributes and custom behavior to that model, as opposed to dealing with like a raw JavaScript plain object that just has some properties. We can add like methods and computed properties, which we'll kind of look at later today. But like, yeah, we can add more custom behavior. Has anyone heard of the term ORM, or object relational mapping? So let me zoom in. Okay, so this is something that's kind of more of a back-end thing, and I kind of teach it in the follow class in the spring. But it stands for object relational mapping. And what this means is kind of in the back-end technologies, we're mapping objects to a relational database. So we have this database, right? But we want to turn all of that data in our database into actual objects, because if we think about our code, we're working with classes and objects. So there needs to be that, or one way of working with the database is to kind of map those rows to objects. And so that's what they call on the backend. So there's kind of libraries or frameworks called ORMs, and they allow us to do that mapping. So on the front end, this is kind of like what Ember Data is doing. It's kind of mapping objects to our API. So it's a very similar concept, and so that's why I kind of wanted to introduce it, because it's almost like a framework in itself in how you work with your data, and it's essentially mapping our API to rich objects or models. Okay, so to start, let's create a route. So we'll say Ember generate route, and we'll call this one GitHub repos. All right, and if you want to Ember serve it, And I'll go ahead and open it up. So we have that default screen. And then we can navigate to /GitHub repo, so the route that we just created. And then let's go ahead and get rid of that welcome page. So I'll just delete this. Okay, so empty page, we're on that route that we just created. If you right click and then go to inspect, you're going to see this tab called Ember, and this is the Ember inspector. So this kind of helps debug Ember applications. Similar to Chrome DevTools, just where you do things like inspect element and all that. We can kind of inspect components. We can look at data that was loaded via Ember Data. We can see all the different routes. Like an interesting thing is if you actually go to LinkedIn, so if I go to linkedin.com, oops, I click on, and you open up the Ember inspector. So LinkedIn's actually written in Ember, but if you click on this Ember tab, you can see, oh, well, like check out all their data or all the components that they're using or all the different routes. This app is actually pretty big, so it might be a tad laggy, but you know, you can get a good idea of like how they made their models and stuff. So kind of a cool thing to check out. Okay, so let's try and consume this endpoint right here. So if we were to kind of think about this, you know, we want to get the repos for a particular organization, which is Ember.js or whatever. And so the way we can kind of achieve this in Ember Data is let's go to our route, and we're going to add a model hook. And we'll say return this.store. Now, so usually in the past we did something like this, right? We said find all post, right? And this would kind of query the API for all post models. But in this case, this isn't really a find all, right? Because there's so many types of repos. These are just the Ember ones. And so there's actually another method on the store called query. And so we can say, let's query for some type of model. In this case, let's call it a GitHub repo. And so the first argument is the model name, which we'll create in a minute. And then the second is some query params. So in this case, we could say something like organization is Ember.js. I'm just kind of making up the query param. So this is like, we're essentially trying to query the API for some organization. Yep.
Like slight problem with the Ember inspector. It doesn't seem to be it's not activating on the pages.
Even on the one that you created, like this one?
Yeah, it's still like grayed out.
Oh, it's grayed out. Maybe close it. Did you close the tab and reopen it?
And it also doesn't work on like LinkedIn.
I think LinkedIn was a tad laggy, or they did something to disable certain features so they couldn't inspect it. But
Right.
I remember at one point I saw it.
Yeah, but it's still like grayed out. Maybe I'll just
Huh. Is it working for anybody else? It is? Okay. It could be like a clash with other plugins. If you have like another plugin, maybe it's clashing with it. I have seen that sometimes.
okay.
Maybe the workaround there would be enable the Ember Inspector plugin or extension in incognito mode, and then open it up in incognito. Or you could just try disabling extensions one by one and just see at which point does it start to work.
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so our first error, it says there's no model for GitHub repo. So let's go ahead and create it. So I'll say Ember generate model. And then we called it GitHub repo when we said query GitHub repo. Right, so the model is GitHub repo. So I created that model, GitHub repo. Now let's define this model. So I'll open this up. And if we're looking at the GitHub repos, we can kind of look at some of these attributes, and let's just kind of add a couple. So one of them is full name. Let's do full name and private. Okay, so I'll say full. Now, if we look at the attributes, they're underscore, right? And we can work with like underscore properties in JavaScript. It just happens to be not the convention. Like in JavaScript, the convention is just camel case. So this is kind of another benefit of Ember Data, where if our API is returning a bunch of underscores, that doesn't mean like our application has to consume it as underscores. We can turn these all into like camel case, or which is kind of the convention. So let's rename this property to full name, and we'll call this. This will be an attribute, which will be a string. And then there's the other one called private, which is ds dot. It's a Boolean. Yeah, there's different languages have different conventions, and so JavaScript kind of follows camel case. Python is kind of big on the underscores. So if your API was written in Python, your Python devs might say, okay, let's make this API in underscores. But then as a JavaScript dev, you're like, no, I don't want to work with underscores, right? Because then you have mixed casing all over the place. You have, sometimes underscores, sometimes camel case, and it just doesn't look nice. So we can actually kind of adjust all this so that all our code is just camel case, and then doesn't matter what the backend returns. Yep.
Can you just go back to the route?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just missed it.
So
Yep.
just to clarify, the data store is like a client cache of all your like models or
Yep.
model objects, right?
Yep. Yeah, and then Ember Data will kind of cache it for us. It can do
Okay.
fancy things like do background reloads to refetch it if it thinks it's stale. Like you can do some smart things in there.
Okay, and you're doing that line is doing a query of all of those objects with.
With for
Okay.
Ember.js, yeah. And so if we kind of look at what's happening here, if we go back here, now we can say, okay, what's the URL? It says localhost / GitHub repos query string organization equals Ember.js. All right, so we're kind of getting there, right? It's not exactly it, but we're gonna adjust it so that it does make sense. Okay, so in Ember Data, there's kind of two pieces to customize things. There's the adapter, which says, let's change the URLs. Let's figure out like where the source of the data is, whether that source is local storage or IndexedDB or I don't know, some NoSQL database or API or WebSockets. Like the source could be all these different places. But in the case of this, we want to say, okay, let's change the API to be api.github.com. So that's the adapter. And then there's the serializer, which handles the structure of the data. So I want to kind of change the format that comes back so that it gets put into Ember Data correctly. So let's go ahead and create an adapter now. So we're going to say Ember generate adapter called GitHub repo. And this is going to be the same name as the model. So the model and the adapter have the exact same name. So when I say this.store.query, find the model of GitHub repo, it's going to use this adapter to figure it out. So if I open up this class, we're going to see something that says export default JSON API adapter. So we're not using JSON API here. This API is just, well, it's not following JSON API. So there's one other adapter built into Ember Data, and it's called the REST adapter. So if we just change this to REST adapter, it won't do some of the JSON API specific things. So at this point, if we go back to the console, the URL is still the same. But with JSON API, they kind of send some headers along and expect certain headers back. But we're not following any of that since you know, the GitHub API doesn't follow JSON API. So to configure the URL, we can call a method called URL for query. And so this function is called whenever we call query off the store. So we say this.store.query, and so that translates into this function being called. And these are kind of referred to as hooks, just because we don't actually explicitly call URL for query anywhere in our app. Just Ember Data will call it for us. We just need to define it, and this allows us to customize it. So I can just return the URL. So I'll kind of paste this here. So if I just paste this full URL, and then I go back to the console, okay, now we can see what's being made. We can see it is making kind of the right URL for the most part. There's this extra query param, which was that organization query param, and then we hard-coded this. So we can modify this a little bit, and instead of hard-coding Ember.js here, I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to say query.organization. And so this query is an object that contains whatever we passed in as the second argument to the query method on the store. So that's what maps to this.
Can you go back to the model file?
Sure. All right, so if I go back to the top, let's see, minimize that. Okay, so get, okay, so it's still making the right call. Now there's this extra query string param, and that's because we kind of passed it in. So we could actually delete this. It doesn't actually, it's not going to cause any problems, most likely for GitHub, but might as well just get rid of it just because otherwise, you know, GitHub could potentially use it, and that could cause problems. So let's just remove it because we know it works without it. So what I'm going to do here is say let URL is equal to this. Then I'll return the URL. And then in between this, I'm going to say delete query.organization. So we're using the query param in the URL. Then we delete it from the query object, and then we just return the URL. And to make this shorter, I'm just going to create another variable called host. And this is going to be api.github.com. So I'll paste this in here. And I'll just say host. All right. So kind of in previous classes, we did things like find all and find record inside of the model hook. So we said this.store.findRecord or find all. There's hooks for configuring that URL inside the adapter. So Just FYI, in the docs, there's kind of all this stuff. But we're just doing it for the query method, which is store.query.
Why are we deleting query documentation?
Ah, yeah. So if I comment this out for a second and then go back, see how the URL has this extra query string param called organization equals ember.js? Yeah, so ideally it's, we don't need that, and GitHub might use it in some way that we don't expect. So if we delete it and then we go back and look at the URL, you can see now the URL, it's gone. Yep.
So what's the point of putting the organization in the first place? If you know it's the Ember.js, why don't you just put it straight to the adapter?
Oh, like hard code it?
Yeah.
You can if you're just only working with just Ember.js, but if you wanted to configure it to say query for all repos from a different organization, right? You want to make it more dynamic, then you wouldn't want it hard coded. But yeah, if you were just working with Ember, then you could just throw it in there. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are you getting an error in your?
Yeah. I mean, we're not completely done, but at least the call is made. But there's other errors.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Mine's telling me to use query record instead of query because I'm getting a single record.
Well, is the call made like this? Is this correct? Like, do you see get request to this, and that's cool? That's the only part, like, yeah, up until this point.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so you're good so far. Okay, so we're done with the adapter. So we said, okay, this is where the API is. Go find it via this URL, and this is how we configured it. The next piece is the serializer. So the serializer is how do we deal with the payloads from the API. So when we do a GET request for the API, we're getting back a response payload, right? And that needs to be structured a particular way. And so by default, Ember Data works with JSON API structure, which if you look at it, if we kind of go back and we were to look at one of the examples, like here's kind of a sample where it says data and attributes and type. There's all this stuff, right? And that looks nothing like this, right? It looks very different. So the serializer will take care of handling the payloads, whereas the adapter is really just like, think of it of the URL. Okay, so Ember Data works with JSON API by default, but we're not using JSON API. So we're going to create a serializer. So we're going to say Ember generate serializer. And this is also the same name as the model. So we'll say GitHub repo. Okay, so from our app, when we work with an API, we're either sending data to the API or we're receiving data. And so if we're receiving data, this is typically your GET request. And if you're sending data, it's typically your post, patch, or put, right? So when you're sending data, you're either creating it, so you got to send along information, or you're editing it, which could either be patch or put, so you're sending it. But when you receive data, it's the GET. And so this process right here, where we are receiving data in our app, is called normalization. And then the process of sending data to the API is called serialization. Okay, so looking at this API, if we need to conform to, or if we need our app to adjust to the this particular payload, which process do you think it is? Yeah, normalization, right? Because we're getting information and we want our app to consume it, so we need to kind of normalize it so that our app knows how to work with it. Okay, so there's a new folder called serializers, and there's one called GitHub repo. So if you want to open it up, and the default generated one is JSON API, so we see ds.json API serializer. We're going to change this to one called just JSON serializer, so just delete that API right there. And so this is another one that's built into Ember Data. And this kind of is easy. It's nice to work with payloads that essentially don't conform to JSON API. There's another one actually kind of built in, but I'll kind of point it out at the end. This is the one I happen to use most of the time when an API isn't JSON API. Okay, so just delete the word API from here. And all right, so what does this JSON serializer look like? So I actually put a link to a blog post I wrote not too long, or maybe in like 2015, I guess. And to give you an idea of what it looks like is if you're getting an array of things, the API is if you're going to use that JSON serializer, it expects a simple array of objects like this. If you're working with a single thing, like you're getting one single object, then you just expect one object. So it's like very simple JSON, which is pretty common, at least with a lot of APIs. Okay, so hopefully you have the Ember Inspector running and it works. If we click on it and then click on Data, and then you click on GitHub repos, you can actually see all the attributes for the model. And if we look at it, we're going to see undefined for full name for everything, right? And then private is false because false is kind of the default Boolean value. Okay, so going back to repos, if we look at this structure, it's actually it's pretty much the JSON serializer format as kind of I showed in this post, right? So it's just an array of objects. And if we look at private, you can say, okay, this is an array of objects, and there is this private. So private is getting mapped correctly. And so if we kind of look at this, none of them are private, so they're all false. But if one happened to be true. So this is getting mapped okay.
Wait, how'd you get all that data?
Yeah, I have 0.
Did you create the serializer?
Yeah.
And you remove the word API from it? And then your route, let's see, the route. It's query GitHub repo. Okay, so is the URL being hit correctly? So we see exactly this URL.
Anything in the
Now I knew.
Oh, if you don't have anything in your console, click on the triple dots and go to settings.
Is this 415 unsupported media type?
401.
415. Return to 415.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. If you click on this under console log XML HTTP request and just refresh, then it will log every single AJAX request your app makes whenever you have the dev tools open.
Then I must not be making the request correctly.
So in theory, you should see XHR get and this, and it should work. But if it's the wrong URL or something,
Can you see all the files?
all right, click on this. Wait, did you click on this settings? You did? Try opening a new tab. Just redo the page.
If you just open the network tab, maybe it's like in you could see the request in there. And also the Ember add-on. So when you first load your page and you open up the add-on, it doesn't have anything like any of your network calls cached and in the add-on, so you have to like actually refresh the page for it to get like populated.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. I'd say for everybody, if you just close the tab and reopen it, does that fix it? No? All right, we'll have to figure it out in lab. Or what you can do is just go to network, go to XHR, refresh the page, and you will see repos right here. So you'll see the call being made. So if you click on headers, you should hopefully see this URL, 200 OK, get. So if this URL is not the same, then yeah, this could be the error.
Can you open up the adapter thing again?
Sure.
So model name, is that supposed to match a model name as well, or is that just generic new model?
It actually turns out to be the name of the model when you call a SORA query. So in this case, it would be GitHub-repo, but we're not using it, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I just had nothing under SHR.
Okay, I guess we'll figure it out later. It's probably just a small typo somewhere, I would think. Okay, so going here, the repos endpoint, it does have an ID, so that's cool. So every resource has an ID. Private's getting mapped correctly because that's just the name and the attribute. The only one that isn't working is full name, and that's because the API is underscored, so full underscore name, as opposed to camel case. And then in our model, we defined it as camel case, right? So if I actually go back and change this to underscore and save it, and then go back to the page, we can see here's full name, right? So it does get loaded, but, and I click on one of these, you can see, okay, here's this attribute called full underscore name. And that's, you know, it works, but I don't want to work with underscores in my app. I just want to follow the JavaScript convention, so I want it to be like this. So how do we configure that? So there's another hook or method inside the serializer that we can say. It's called key for attribute. And so if I just do a console log on key, and I'll just say return, I'll just say return key. Let's take a look at kind of what's being logged here. So if I check it out, you can see as it's looping over the array from the API, it spits out full name, private, and it spits out the camel case version, right? And so it's saying, okay, what's the key for the attribute? So what's the, so our attribute is full name camel case, and then what's the key in the API that maps to that? So what we can do here is we can say return underscore key. And actually, you know what? This should actually be named. I think it would make more sense saying this is the attribute. So we'll say attribute, and I'll get rid of method because we don't need it. All right, so I want to underscore the attribute, which is full capital N name. And where does this underscore function come from? We can actually import this from Ember. So we can say import underscore from @ember/string. So there's a lot of different like string utilities in Ember. So if we want to take a string and say turn it to hyphenated, or turn it to underscored, or turn it to camel case. We can use functions in the Ember string package. All right, so we're basically taking full name and turning it into underscored or snake case, which is also called. And if I save it, did I go back and change my model? Yeah, so my model is good. So it still has full name. And I go back, I look at the Ember inspector, we can see full name is there. Yes?
For what just happened, was it like previously it wasn't reading full name because that wasn't a thing in the API?
Yeah.
This was like converting full camel case name to like full underscore.
Exactly.
Which then it can read, and now it's stuff.
Yep, so this was doing, yeah, full name to full name. Yeah. So there isn't too many customizations, and I like the main takeaway I want you to see from this is that it's kind of like an interesting abstraction, because even if you weren't using Ember Data and you were working with some other front end framework and you wanted to write a library for your app for interfacing with some API, this might give you some ideas on how to break things out. So you could have adapters for figuring out like what the URL is or where the source of the data is. And then the serializer is really dealing with the payload format. So things like underscored keys versus camel case keys, or if you had extra attributes in there like data, right? You could all handle this inside that serializer layer to kind of abstract away the specifics of the API from your application. So all your app sees really is like in the app part, you really just see, let's see, where is it? Right, so you make a store call, you define a model with some attributes, and then your app really only thinks about that. And then the API specifics are just isolated to that adapter and serializer layer. Any questions? All right, so let's do another example. Let's do the Reddit one, because this one's a little bit more complicated. You think we can do it? All right, so if we look at the API, right, it's kind of similar to the repos one, where there's underscored keys, and we, whoops, wrong one. It's an array of objects, and there's underscored keys. If we look at this one, the array of objects is located in data.children, but everything is underscored, and then for each object, there's this data attribute, right, which really all the attributes are nested inside data, so we want to get rid of that data just to kind of flatten it out. All right, so I'm going to close that. Okay, so let's generate another route. So I'm going to say Ember generate route. We'll call this, we'll just call it Reddit. And then I'll navigate to /Reddit. Okay, so this one's kind of similar to the GitHub repos one, where we want to say, I want to get all, we can call it Reddit posts. Each one's a post. But we're not getting all of them. We're only getting the ones related to cats. So if we go to our route and we add a model hook, so anyone want to take a stab at kind of what we might call on the store? Yep, query. And then let's call each one a Reddit post. This name is kind of made up, but whatever makes the most sense. So maybe we call this,
Subreddit?
yeah, let's call that subreddit, in this case, cats. So if we go to our app, okay, so the error is no model was found for Reddit post. So let's go ahead and create that. So say Ember generate model called Reddit post. And while we're at it, let's just create the adapter and serializer just because we're going to need it. So I'll say Ember generate adapter called Reddit post as well. And then also say Ember generate adapter serializer called Reddit post. So just remember, they all have the same name. The model, adapter, and serializer, all called Reddit post. Yep.
Isn't this technically normalization? Or like, is it what we're doing is normalization, or
Yeah, we're doing normalization.
so then why is it a serializer?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so the serializer does normalization and serialization. Yeah. Good. Yeah. No, that's a good question. Fancy words, but yeah. So I think of normalization when I receive data, and serialization is like when I send it. Huh. I guess a way you could think of it is like serialization is when I'm sending, so SS. I mean, easier to remember, I guess, right? And then normalization is like receiving.
Yeah, rather than like
Any other questions? This is definitely kind of one of the more advanced topics, but it's it's pretty powerful. Okay, so if we look at the URL, it says localhost 4200 Reddit post query string subreddit equals cats. So let's get the URL configured correctly. So I'll go to Reddit post. We'll change this to the REST adapter like we did in the last one because we're not using JSON API. And we're going to also use URL for query. And I'm going to copy out the URL. So I'll just say return, paste that in there. All right, so for cats, we're going to replace this with query dot what we called was subreddit in the model, right? So over here, this was subreddit. So I'll say let URL is equal to this. And like before, we'll say return URL, and then in between we'll kind of delete the query.subreddit to get rid of that query string. And just so this isn't like such a long line, I'll just say host is equal to this. I'll just say host here. The only reason I put these here is I have a package that kind of auto completes it, so I always know, like, I customize these things so much that it's nice remembering like what the parameters were for each function. But we actually don't need this. All right, so if we go back to our app and look, we can see, okay, so it did make the call to get Reddit, so the right URL. Now we're getting errors because the structure doesn't match the JSON API one, and that's the default. And so if we open up that serializer that we created for Reddit post, we're going to change this JSON API serializer to just JSON serializer. So just like before.
For the GitHub adapter, are we supposed to do JSON REST or like the REST?
Yeah, it's also the REST adapter.
Oh, can you that's
Oh, that, yeah. Yep.
I'm the same errors before, and like the GET request isn't going to the URL. Like localhost /
Even with this function,
Yeah, I assume I just find that function right.
is it spelled correctly?
Yeah, I think so.
And did you return the URL? Oh, yeah. Question?
Why? I know you mentioned this before, but why do we change it to REST instead of the?
Yeah, I didn't go into it a whole lot, but with JSON API, when we make these requests, they send certain headers which are like information about the request, and we're not using any of those headers, and so that's why there's only really two adapters in Ember, which is the REST one and the JSON API one, and since we're not using that JSON API specific stuff, we just default back to the regular REST one, which doesn't send like the extra headers. If we were to look at it like, let's see. Right, if I click on like this URL in the console and I click on this and we look at headers, we can see that request URL, it made a get request, but if I go back and change the subreddit or the Reddit one to, where is it? I'll just do it just to show. If I change this back to JSON API adapter and I look at this, let's see. Here it is. Okay, see request headers. There's this accept JSON API stuff. There's like very specific JSON API stuff which we're not using, and that could throw off the API. So we're just downgrading in a way. Yeah. So if I'll change this back to REST adapter, and I click on this, you can see that JSON API specific stuff is gone. All right, so let's kind of define some attributes on our model. So we see author full name. So inside this data object, there's author full name. We could say, I think there's ups and score. Yeah, score, edited. So let's kind of add some of these. So I'll go into my Reddit post model, and let's map these. So I'll say, all right, let's do author full name. So author underscore full name. I want to call this author full name, and this is a string. Score was a number, so ds.adder, that's a number. Let's say title, right? So title, ds.string. Now let's do a Boolean. Let's see. There's a lot of attributes here. I will just say clicked. Clicked, ds.adder, Boolean. Those are most of the types. There's only one other type. There's date, but yeah. Boolean number string. Okay, so if we go back to our app and we see Reddit post, okay, it says 0, right? But if we look at the API, the array is nested inside data.children. So how do we kind of tell Ember Data, or which part where we would we tell Ember Data that the array is inside data.children? Do you think it would be the adapter or the serializer? Yeah, exactly. So I'll go to the Reddit post serializer. Okay, so we're doing normalization, and so there's a hook called normalize query response. And so query, because inside of the route we were calling query. So there's also like a normalized find all response, a normalized find record response. And it receives kind of a handful of arguments. These are just all the ones I listed out. All right, and if you notice in here, we actually get access to the raw payload. This is the raw thing we get back from the API. So what I want to do here is I'm going to say return this dot underscore super, and I'm just going to pass in all the parameters into this. So this is like the default function. By calling this dot super, I'm saying call the original normalized query response, and then in between, we're going to customize it. So we know that the JSON serializer expects like an array of objects, and when we call this dot super, it's expecting this payload to be that array of objects. So we need to take what we get back from the API and turn that into a regular array of objects. So the way we can do this is we can just redefine payload, and we'll say payload is equal to payload.data.children. Maybe we just call this a new variable. We could say like let I don't know what name to give it, so let's just overwrite payload. Okay, so we're kind of, diving into that raw payload, extracting that array of objects, and then passing that to the original normalized query response via this dot super. And so now when it gets called, it has an array of objects. So we're kind of like intersecting the response before we call what was originally intended. So if I go back to the app, okay. And so if we go to the console, we see an error. So you must include an ID for a Reddit post. And so every resource or every object that we get back from the API needs to have an ID. And so if we look at this, each one right here, it's an object, but there is no ID. It only has attributes kind and data. And if we look inside data, I'm pretty sure there's an ID in here. All right, let's just search. Here it is. Okay. So here's ID. So what we really want to say is look inside that data property. We don't really care about kind because we're not really using it. So we just want to say, hey, each one should really be the data. So if we go back to here, we're going to say, let's map. So we can call a map function, and this will take an array and kind of translate it to another array. So I can say map, and this will receive the, we can just call it item. And then we can say return item.data. So we're essentially creating a new array that excludes the data property. So it kind of loops through all the items and says each resource is that data object. Yep.
Not to seem pessimistic, but are we going to do this for homework?
No. No, this is just more to just show you like another abstraction on how to work with APIs instead of just calling like $.ajax. Yeah, and this I think it's also useful if you ever hop into the like doing backend frameworks. You're gonna see like the same pattern in there, just working with databases as opposed to APIs. So like you'll have a leg up at least when learning that stuff too. Like all these web apps are kind of built on so many abstractions that you never really write like the low level stuff anymore. Like I rarely write $.ajax anymore, so it's just kind of like good understanding like what these abstractions are and how to use them.
So what is this item?
Item. This is if we go back to this, it's each one of these objects. Because we data.children was this array, right? And so item is one of these, but we want to extract it and turn it into just the array of the data objects. So we're kind of map creates an array, a new array from an existing array. And so when we map over it, it kind of loops through it and says, okay, then this a new array is composed of just those data objects. Okay, so if I save it now, and if we load up the Ember inspector, all right, so we're pretty close, right? We see score being populated, we see clicked and title, the ID, no errors. The only thing that's not populated is author full name. So anyone want to guess why that one's not being populated?
Because camel case.
Yep. Yep, so our model was camel case, and we wanted to, okay, so let me kind of just, if I change this back to snake cased, and then refresh, you can see, okay, it gets loaded, but I don't want it I don't want it snake cased, so we're going to turn it to camel case, at least in our app. So then in the serializer, we'll say key for attribute, and this receives the attribute. And we're going to say return underscore attribute. And then we'll import underscore from @ember/string. So now all attributes, it will expect it to be camel cased, unless you have like a word that doesn't have two words in it.
Is it kind of unintuitive to call a function called underscore and turn everything into camel case?
I guess this was just designed. This is how Ember Data was designed. Like they have this in their docs called key for attribute. So I could see how that could be a tad misleading. Like it might be more intuitive to convert the other way, right? Like say I have this key and I want to turn it into camel case for the attribute. I don't know why they designed it that way. That's just how it works. So, but yeah.
Well, it's like you're modifying the key is what you defined in your model, and you're converting it to the same key that's in the API, right?
Yeah. So attribute is equal to like full name. Yeah, and so we're underscoring that. So turning it into the API key. It was probably some design decision they came up with, but yeah. So we'll say full name is going to full name. Okay, so now we got our data loaded.
I'm not testing.
We're not getting anything in the data.
It's like in Ember.
In the Ember, inspector. I think I just missed something. Or, like,
Okay, yeah, I
That's
can.
what happened to me in GitHub.
Oops.
It's fine.
No.
yeah.
All right, so Reddit post for the model, adapter, and serializer.
This.
Wait, so, okay, serializer. JSON
If you're getting a 404, then it's probably the adapter, and then something is missing here because that's trying to figure out the URL to hit.
I forgot to put
Oh, okay.
Did you go have
Any questions? All right, so what I thought we could do is just do a class exercise so you guys give this one a chance, and then we'll do it in like 20 minutes. So orgs, if we do org/ember, this returns a single object. And so what we can do is create a route. We'll say ember generate route. Let's see, we'll call this GitHub org. And so in this route, do an example where we load up this endpoint through Ember Data with the customizations, and then we can just give you a chance of trying it on your own. Okay, here, let me start. Okay, so we'll start by adding a model hook, and I'm gonna say return this.store.find record, and we'll call this GitHub org. and then the ID will be Ember.js. So from this call, write the adapter and serializer to make this work.
What should we name like the adapters and serializers?
So those have to be the same name as the model name.
Oh, it's model name?
Yeah, which is, in this case, right here.
And then the root name doesn't matter. Like you could have called the model inside of the root, whatever. And it would have been okay. Like if
Like this.
yeah, like if
Yeah.
you changed that to like
I could literally call it the word whatever. As long as the adapter's name whatever and the serializer's name whatever, it would all
it would
work together.
It doesn't matter that route. The route is called GitHub dashboard.
Yeah, that didn't matter. That was just by accident.
Alright. And that does make sense though.
Yeah.
You're gonna confuse yourself.
So like the routes can be the same name as like the model adapter serializer?
It can, but it doesn't need to be. That just so happened to be the case. Like, I could have just called this org. Maybe that makes more sense. I don't know. But yeah, just knowing that convention, those don't have to be the same. Yeah.
Would it query or find record?
Yeah, that's what I was
So in this case, we could say find record because we're just we're finding one thing. Query is expecting finding a list of things. And in this case, we're saying yeah.
What data do we want?
This one api.github.com.
Or like from.
Oh, just pick a couple attributes. Let's do name, avatar URL, and login. And kind of as an FYI, like if you want to check out the docs for all these different functions, if you go to the main Ember.js site and then under the docs tab, there's API reference. So if I click that and then I click on Ember Data, you'll see all the different classes. So the one we used was JSON serializer. So I'll open that in the new tab and then the REST adapter. So for example, if we look at the REST adapter and then we scroll down a bit, you can see all these different methods. So the one we called was URL for query, but there's also URL for find record. And so you can kind of look at each one of these and get examples, and then same thing with the serializer. So there's a lot of different functions that we can use to work with some of these custom APIs. And I would say that there's never like one single way to do it. You might use one, you could probably achieve the same thing a few different ways. So I'll put links to this in the channel.
So if you were using find record, would that still work with URL for query?
No, so then you'd have to use URL for find records.
What attributes we wanted to
you just say pick some?
Just pick a few.
Pick whichever one. Okay.
Maybe do some that are snake case and some that aren't. So you got like a mix.
Did you do the URL to find record instead of the URL for query?
Yes.
What's this?
What is the URL for GitHub API?
Oh yeah, it's I'll paste that too. There we go.
So what we're passing in is the ID, or is it type? Since the URL for find record expects a type and an ID.
Oh, this. Oh yeah, so the type is what do we call it? GitHub org, and then the ID would be Ember.js. And then behind the scenes, right? They have this. These are the parameters for the function. This one has a couple extra things, but I think you'll only need the ID.
Did you post this link in Slack?
Oh yeah, I already did
Oh, you did? Oh.
in the channel or the general channel.
Okay, so when I'm doing a URL for my record with the ID of Ember.js,
Mhm.
it fetches the data right, but when it comes back, it gets like the ID from like the JSON from the payload that gets sent back. I guess overwrites
Oh,
the ID, and I'm getting like 2 records where I should have 1. So record of type.
yes. Okay. Yeah. So there's another one. Inside the adapter. Wait, what's this one? Let's see. Oh, it's not documented. All right, let me try and see if it's in an older version.
Literally.
It's weird. Why isn't it in here? So there's another attribute called primary key, but it's not in the docs. Is it working though?
Yeah, I'm just getting 2 records. For,
Okay.
Well, like
Yeah, same.
Okay, so okay, if you got to that part, cool, and then we'll fix it. There's another thing.
okay.
Well, let's see. Okay, so one approach that you could do is actually inside the serializer, change the ID to like map the right, because we see login is this, so just overwrite the ID with what's in login, and then this way what you get back would be expected. Does that make sense? Yeah. so in the normalize function, you're just going to say ID is equal to login, and then this way you won't get that like weird issue.
Say that again. In the normalize function, you're setting
The ID equal to login. Yeah, so I think the issue was that when we said find record, we said find record of ID Ember.js, right? But the ID that we get back is this number. So what we can do in the serializer in the normalize function is to say ID, set the ID equal to this thing, the login.
so that.
This way,
It still normalize query response even though we're not querying finding a record.
it would be normalize find record response. Yeah, because we called find record on the store.
Yeah, that fixed it.
Cool.
What was the find record normalized find?
Normalize find record response. So if we look here, we'll see this one, normalize find record response. So how many people got it? Or got close at least? Nice. This is definitely one of the harder pieces.
For some reason, it's turning my GitHub orgs into camel case as well.
GitHub org into camel case. So the attributes in the model you listed as camel case,
Yes.
and then what comes back is underscored, right?
Yes. I think, no, it's not. It's like when it's calling the GET request, it's supposed to be GitHub -org,
Oh,
but it turned into an
oh, like the URL.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I mean, so you can actually just override the URL and say, like in the example we did for this, right? URL instead of URL for query, do URL for find record, and then hard code the URL in there, or semi hard coded. Okay, so I think we could kind of do it together. If everyone's ready. All right, so I think the route was called GitHub org. So I'll navigate to GitHub org. Okay, so the first error, it says oh, whoops, thanks. Okay, so no model found for GitHub org. So we'll go ahead and create that. So I'll say Ember generate model called GitHub org. We could say Ember generate adapter called GitHub org. And then we'll also create that serializer called GitHub org. Okay, so we got the three pieces. And if we look at the org, we'll say, let's pick off name. Let's say name. Sure, let's do that. Name and is verified in email. Let's see. Okay, so we'll go to GitHub org. So we'll say name, which is ds.adder. It's a string. We'll say email, ds.adder. It's a string. Is verified, which is ds.adder. It's a boolean. And let's do a number too. Public repos. So say public repos and ds.adder number. Okay, so just a handful of attributes. And I'll copy this endpoint. And if we look at it, okay, so the URL is wrong. So let's fix this. So we'll go to the adapter. So this configures the URL. We'll change it to REST adapter instead of JSON API. And then we can call URL for find record. And I'll say let URL is equal to that. And we'll say return URL. And then here for Ember.js, we're saying this is the ID. So we can say ID. Okay, so we got the adapter. So we are hitting the right thing. So now if we look at the console, it'll kind of tell you at least where the error is. So assertion failed, normalized response must, and if we expand it, we could must return a valid JSON API document. So saying that we're not, this isn't following JSON API. So if we go to that same serializer, we'll change it to JSON serializer. And at least at this point now there's no errors. And if we look at Ember, or the Ember inspector, we can see, okay, so the only thing that's really mapping correctly is the Ember.js. And okay, so let's take care of a couple things. Okay, so you notice we have two records here. One is Ember.js and one is the ID, and this is because the ID that comes back is this. But we said in our find record call right here, we said the ID is this, so that the API that we're the ID that we're requesting is not the same as what's returned from the API. So we go in here and we can say normalize find record response, and we'll say return this dot underscore super, and I'll just paste all these same arguments in here. Oops. All right, so we're going to say payload.id is equal to payload.login. Since login, if we look at the login, that's the one that we're kind of treating as the ID. We could have left it this way, but as a if I were just using this, I wouldn't know to think, oh, the Ember ID is 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever this is, right? I would think just what's the handle. So we're just going to kind of remap that. So now if we go back and look at this, okay, now there's only one record, which is good. The name is mapping correctly. Email, I think, was null in the first place. Yeah, so it's null, so that's okay. Okay, so these two are not mapping correctly, and that's because these are underscored. So we'll go here and we'll say key for attribute. And I'm going to change this to attribute. And we'll say return underscore attribute, and then we'll import this at the top. So import that from Ember at string. Oh, and I forgot the comma. Oh, sure. So now if we look at Ember Inspector, okay, so now we see the 46 show up, so everything's working. Yes.
The thing with the payload ID, like the remapping stuff,
Mhm.
it didn't quite work out for me. It's still like showing 2 there.
It's showing 2?
Yeah.
Is it normalized find record response?
Oh, I didn't.
Mine is still not working.
Okay, it worked now. I just spelled it wrong.
We can check it out. I guess unless there's a specific error.
We requested.
Any other questions?
I'll read you my error.
Oh yeah.
You requested a record of type GitHub dashboard with ID Ember.js, but the adapter returned a payload with primary data having an ID of
The number.
store dot find record.
Let's see. In the route, was it all lowercase like this? And does this match the login name?
Oh, your application code is empty.
Wait, actually, what also could happen is, if you have like a syntax error, then it won't refresh, and you're looking at an old error. So do you have like a missing comma or something, or like a missing curly?
I don't think so.
Like if you do another change, do you see the app reload?
That's kind of.
If I break it intentionally.
Like throw a console log somewhere, and then if you don't see the app reload, then there's probably a build error, which you would actually probably see in the terminal, like saying something like syntax is wrong or something.
Could you click over to your application.hps?
I got the same error when my adapter was wrong. So like making sure that you have the right parameters.
Oh, these?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're actually not even using any of these, so I can actually delete those.
Why?
Oh, okay. Cool, thanks.
So there's nothing to render.
Yeah, we're not rendering anything. We're
I
just...
still have to, even though I changed it to ID.
Alright, let's check it out in lab. It's probably like something small.
It shows if you want to make any models.
Okay, so the last thing I kind of wanted to mention was, okay, so this terminology here is kind of from the perspective of the app. So from the app's perspective, it's when it receives data, it needs to normalize it. When it's sending data, it needs to serialize it. Now, if you were to reverse the roles and say I was producing an API, right? So here's my API, and then here's, I'm sending it to some client. So this could be like an Ember app, a phone, whatever. So when I collect the data from a database and send it via API, this is called serialization. And then when as an API, from the API's perspective, when I receive it, I am going to normalize it. Normalize it. So if you kind of look at this, it's a little backwards, right? From the API, here we said, you know what? I drew this back. I think it'll be clear if we do it this way. API, app. So as I'm sending data to the app, I am serializing it. And when I receive, okay, so let me make this clear, API. So as an API, when I receive the data, it's normalizing, which is kind of the opposite of what's here, right? So it's really based on perspective. As an app, when I send, I'm serializing, and when I receive, I'm normalizing. But from an API, when I send, I'm serializing, and when I receive, I'm normalizing. Okay, so on the class links, I just put links to all the all the serializers that are kind of built into Ember. So we looked at the JSON one, and in the past couple of weeks, we were using the default JSON API one. There's another one called REST serializer, which actually it works really well if you're creating APIs using Ruby on Rails. Ruby on Rails has like I think they have a serializer that spits out a format that matches kind of what Ember Data expects, because I think they created this just because a lot of people using Rails also use Ember, and so just because that combination of technologies is common, they made that integration a little bit easier. So if you're having to write it back into Rails, this one might be appealing, but otherwise, I typically use this, or if I'm using JSON API, I would use this. If I had control over writing my API and the front end, I would kind of go JSON API all the way, just because it's very structured. I don't have to do any of these customizations. I don't even have to think about it. But if you happen to work with an API that's either third party, or maybe your coworker didn't follow JSON API and they just kind of did their own thing, this JSON serializer is usually pretty good. And then the reason I brought this piece up is Mirage. So in Mirage, when we're simulating APIs, it spits out JSON API by default. But if we want to spit out something custom, then we need to write a serializer inside Mirage too. So from Mirage's side, which is the API, I need to write a non-JSON API format, and then from the app's perspective, I need to handle that non-JSON API format. So you have to kind of do it extra work twice, which is why if you have control, going the JSON API route just works great, right? Because then you don't have to write any of this. But it's just good to know. Okay, so this is definitely kind of a more advanced topic, but it's good to know if you're going to happen to doing any backend, or you want ideas on how do you create like a library for working with an API. This is just one approach. It's probably, it's very robust, but it is a tad complicated because it has to be flexible for so many different kinds of APIs. They want to make it work with everybody. So it is a little bit complicated. I wrote an entire book on this just because it's just because, like, if you use Ember in a workplace, you're not going to always have control over that API, and especially like at my job right now, like it's half of it's JSON API, half of it isn't. And even when it's JSON API, it's not like fully JSON API. It's like JSON API with some custom tweaks. And I'm not writing the API, so it kind of, I can't really, I try and say, okay, write JSON API, but nobody always listens. So it helps, like, trying to convince an entire team to say, hey, follow it this way, like, it's pretty hard. So it's good to like know about the different pieces. So if anybody's curious, or you ever run the situation, I'll send you a copy. You don't have to pay for it or anything.
Finish this book like the same day in school.
Wait, say that again?
Like, it's just completed on August 22nd, which I believe.
I just make periodic updates. I actually wrote it like 2 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I make updates because as Ember Data evolves, like, I adjust it so it stays relevant.
How do you choose that?
I outsource that to, what is it called? 99designs.com. Pay $10 and we'll make you a cover.
Wow.
So it's probably only worth $10. But I can't do graphics for the life of me, so it's better than what I could come up with.
Oh, I thought it was like.
Yeah, if anyone wants to create a new cover for me, that'd be awesome.
Extra credit.
Yeah.
Honestly, competition. Let's go.
I'll even put your name on there. Yeah, so if anyone ever runs that situation, just email me. I'll send you a copy. And given that I didn't cover the rest of this stuff, I thought, that was going to be shorter. No homework today.
Thank you. Yes. We can breathe for 2 seconds.
So I'll move this to next week. All right, actually, 1 second. All right, so any questions on stuff today? If not, I'll stop it.